In the dark underbelly of organized crime, some men rose to power on the backs of betrayal, carving out empires with blood-stained hands and silver-tongued deals. They were tyrants, treacherous and unyielding, who betrayed friends, family, and even their own crime families to claw their way to the top, only to find themselves surrounded by shadows with knives at their throats. Today, we're counting down 5 of the most treacherous tyrants in Mafia history, beginning with Orazio Tropea. A feared enforcer for the Jenner family in Chicago, Tropea built his empire with stolen funds and cold-blooded killings, but when his loyalty wavered, he found himself on a deserted street corner, staring down the barrel of a shotgun wielded by his own betrayed brothers. Tropea's violent end served as a grisly reminder: in the Mafia, loyalty is more than a virtue, it's the only shield you've got. And once you break it, not even the darkest corners of the city can hide you. Orazio Tropea was a man born in the shadow of Sicily's cold iron skies, where the rules of loyalty, betrayal and brutal justice were absolute. By the time he landed on American soil in 1909, he'd left behind a wife and children in Catania, Italy, bonds that would wither in his absence, replaced by a relentless thirst for power and a restlessness that led him to work as an enforcer for the Jenner brothers in Chicago. Tropea's life was a volatile ascent, a tumble into a murky world of shifting allegiances and vendettas that bound him to others by debt, violence and blood. His transition into the American underworld was anything but subtle. Tropea began his career not in the soft glow of fine restaurants or the smoke-filled offices of family advisors, but on the streets of Buffalo, collecting debts in the dead of night and pressing his demands with the kind of quiet force that made grown men tremble. By 1920, he had 2 wives, one from Sicily, one a Buffalo woman named Helen Brown, and a son named Lawrence. In Chicago, under the Jenner brothers, he grew into a figure as feared as he was loathed, a man whose collected debts left shops boarded up and businesses cowering behind closed doors. Yet Tropea's ambitions outpaced the Jenner brothers. After seeing the heavy hand of the Jenners falter in the wake of Michelle Merlot's death, he began shifting his alliances, meeting with men who wore the Jenner family's blood on their hands: Samuzzo Amatuna, Antonio Spano, and others who had tasted revenge and wanted more. The Jenner brothers fell like dominoes. Angelo was gunned down at the wheel of his car, his blood painting the inside of the windshield in sticky layers of scarlet. Mike Jenner was shot dead in a violent gunfight with police. And Tony, his hand shaking that of Cavaliero Spagno, was executed in the middle of a crowded street. Tropea took these betrayals as an invitation to climb higher, gathering the scraps of power the Jenners left behind. But with each move, he lost more of himself, his soul hardening to steel and coal. In the spring of 1925, he was tasked with a seemingly simple job, raising funds to cover the legal defense of John Scalisi and Albert Anselmi, 2 Jenner enforcers embroiled in a brutal police shooting. The means Tropea used were anything but simple. He strode into the shops and cafes of Little Italy, pressing his hand into the shoulder of each business owner, demanding cash with a casual smile and a hint of menace. "Your boys need you," he'd say, his hands sliding across their counters and over their tills. He took their funds, pressing the bills into his suit pocket without a second thought, returning time and again, his demands increasing until merchants whispered his name with a combination of terror and resentment. His collection spiraled into extortion so vicious that whispers spread throughout Chicago Tropea had become a plague, the Sicilians calling him the Scourge. But you know, men who live by extortion don't get far without stepping on the wrong toes. In January of 1926, Henry Spingola, a Jenner family in-law, joined Tropea at Amato's restaurant for a night of poker and whiskey. Spingola, worn down by Tropea's ruthless collections, had contributed less than expected in the latest round, and he wasn't happy about it. Tropea watched Spingola that night with a calculating stare, his eyes cold as stone beneath the dim lights of Amato's. As Spingola stepped outside, his breath visible in the winter air, 2 gunmen moved in, shooting him dead where he stood. The neighborhood buzzed with rumors that it was Tropea himself who'd orchestrated the murder, a final warning to anyone who dared resist him. Spingola's body had barely cooled when rumors began circulating that Tropea had not only betrayed the Jenners, but had also pocketed significant amounts from the Scalisi-Anselmi Defense Fund, ostensibly to line his own pockets. His betrayals, of loyalty, of money, of blood, had piled high, each a fresh wound in the already fragile alliances that kept the Chicago Mafia from tearing itself apart. Yet he wore his defiance like a second skin, considering himself untouchable. The scars of his betrayal ran deep, and tonight they would claim their due. Under the false identity Orazio Tropea had managed to build a comfortable life. He flaunted his wealth and influence, taking up residence at the Congress Hotel, where he was known to entertain a young woman, Beatrice Gould. Beatrice, a Chicago teenager caught in Tropea's seductive orbit, was his most recent conquest. He'd presented her with mink coats and lavish jewels, each gift a link in a chain she wore willingly. But even as he basked in his ill-gotten luxury, the whispers of his treachery wove a noose around him. On the cold night of February 15th, 1926, Orazio Tropea stepped off an eastbound streetcar at the intersection of South Halsted and West Taylor Streets in Chicago. Shadows pooled beneath the street lamps, casting long, lean fingers across the snow-slicked streets. Tropea's figure, dressed in a tailored dark overcoat, moved briskly through the damp chill, unaware that the final act of his life was closing in on him. He adjusted his hat, his breath forming small clouds that dissolved into the night air. Every footfall seemed to echo, hollow and ominous against the wet pavement. A black sedan idled a few yards from where Tropea now walked, its headlights darkened. He didn't notice the car creep forward, the tires whispering against the icy ground. His mind was elsewhere, perhaps savouring the wealth he'd accrued or plotting his next betrayal. Then, as if emerging from the shadows themselves, the vehicle pulled alongside him and a figure slipped out. The muzzle of a double-barreled shotgun, glinting under the dim streetlight, was pressed against his temple. Tropea's last breath came out in a frozen gasp as he looked into the unyielding, empty gaze of his executioner. In a heartbeat, the stillness of the night shattered. A deafening blast roared and Tropea's skull fragmented, flesh and bone exploding across the street in a violent spray. Blood splattered onto the sidewalk and pooled, the thick metallic scent mixing with the smell of gunpowder. His body dropped with a dull thud, lifeless and forsaken. For the onlookers who soon gathered, there was no pity, only morbid curiosity. Tropea's body lay crumpled, his face a grotesque mask of terror, almost unrecognizable, bathed in blood and broken bone. Chicago's Sicilian communities, hearing of his death, breathed a collective sigh of relief, as if the city itself had exhaled a long-held breath. There would be no grand funeral procession, no crowd of mourners. The ties he had severed in life ensured that his death would pass with as little ceremony as a beggar's. In his pockets, the police found nearly $1,000 in cash and a large diamond ring, both useless to him now, mere relics of a life spent in betrayal. More intriguing, however, was the small, well-worn notebook, crammed with the addresses and phone numbers of mafiosi from across the country. The notebook's pages were lined with names that rang like a dark roll call: Joe Aiello of Utica, who would soon make his mark in Chicago; Tony Lombardo, president of the powerful Unione Siciliana; and Sam Lavullo of Buffalo, all part of a hidden network binding the underworld from coast to coast. News of the notebook's contents hit the papers, scandalizing Chicago's Sicilian mafia. With each line revealed to the public, new rifts cracked open, laying bare the fragile trust that barely held the crime families together. The cold, unmarked grave Tropea was destined for became a symbol of his ignominious end. He had gone from a terror in Chicago to a lesson in betrayal's price, his death a silent warning scrawled across the city's dark heart. When his mistress, Beatrice, arrived to identify the remains, she wore a black veil that obscured her face, yet her hands betrayed a slight tremor. She looked upon the shell of a man she had once known and was silent. For a moment, the street, the city, even the world itself seemed to pause. She turned away without a word, her mink coat drawn tight around her, disappearing into the crowd that had come to gawk at the fallen gangster. When you're neck-deep in the mafia's web, betrayal isn't just a possibility, it's an eventuality. Antonio "Tony" Bendestrollo knew this better than most. A kingpin of the Genovese crime family with a smirk that dared anyone to challenge him, Strollo reigned over Greenwich Village and the east side of Manhattan with a lethal mix of charm and menace. But in a world where alliances were as brittle as autumn leaves, even the sharpest players could find themselves at the mercy of shifting loyalties. His disappearance in 1962 wasn't just another Mafia casualty, it was the eerie climax of whispers, power plays and promises sealed in blood. Buckle up as we dive into the mysterious vanishing of Tony Bender, a tale where loyalty is fickle, power is fleeting, and the only certainty is death lurking in the dark. Antonio Tony Bender Strollo was born into a world where the scent of ambition mixed with the rank odour of desperation in the narrow alleys of Greenwich Village. The year was 1899, and the city was a beast, breathing steam and spewing coal ash. The son of Leone and Jenny Strollo, immigrants who clawed their way through the city's underbelly, Tony learned early that survival wasn't given. It was carved out with blood-streaked fingernails. The turn of the century sharpened the neighbourhood shadows, thickened with whispered threats and the metallic clang of dockside labour. By the time Tony had grown into his lean frame, he was already familiar with the price of power. The men who ran these streets, with their waxed moustaches and hidden knives, nodded in approval when Tony walked past, a child with eyes too knowing for his age. His older brothers, Samuel and Dominic, tried to steer clear of the darker business, but Tony leaned into it, his curiosity darkening to obsession. The Prohibition years exploded with a frenzy, and Tony Bender thrived like a weed in cracked pavement. He aligned himself with Joe Masseria, playing the dangerous game of allegiance and betrayal during the Castellamarese War. His loyalty, however, was slippery, shifting like a shadow when Charles Lucky Luciano's plan unfolded with the speed and ferocity of a gunshot. As the final bloody act concluded, the streets were washed clean of old loyalties, and Strollo, now a lieutenant in the rebranded Luciano family, surveyed the carnage with the detached eye of a hawk. Greenwich Village was his, a kingdom built on favours paid in screams and debts, etched in ledger books as red as the dawn sky. The cobblestones outside the nightclubs and cafes thrummed with activity. Men whispered his name like a prayer and a curse. The West Side docks, slick with oil and sweat, answered only to him. If a man wanted to eat, he paid Strollo's tax. If he wanted to live, he paid double. One wrong move, and the cold waters of the Hudson would clutch at the unlucky soul, swallowing him before the first cry of regret. But nothing in the underworld was eternal. Strollo's fortune grew fat on loan sharking and gambling, but so did the eyes watching him. The late 1950s came with a chill that seemed to settle in his bones. The Genovese crime family, led by Vito Genovese himself, a man with a smile like a blade's edge, shifted into narcotics, a step that turned even the boldest men cautious. Strollo, ever the strategist, manoeuvred carefully, yet the game had grown too large, the players too many, and not all debts could be repaid. September 1959 was a night too quiet to be safe. Tony Bender dined at Marino's, an upscale haunt where the clink of glasses masked the murmur of secrets. The room seemed alive with unspoken pacts, the smoke coiling like a conspirator around him. At his side sat Anthony Carfano, whose laughter faltered when a waiter whispered in his ear. The ensuing moments were a flurry of tension, faces hardening like statues. The two men left in a rush, but only Carfano's luck had finally run out. He was found hours later, his body slumped in the back seat of a car, the dark stain of betrayal blossoming across his chest. Tony Bender knew better than to mourn, but the whispers that followed clung like a death shroud. Vito's eyes, narrowed behind bars as he served his sentence for narcotics, had not forgotten. Each passing day, inside Sing Sing seemed to twist the steel wires of his patience tighter. Genovese's rage seeped into the family like poison, and Tony Strollo's name surfaced in conversations that ended with knives drawn and smiles replaced by thin, bloodless lines. By the spring of 1962, the clock ticked loudest in Tony's head. The Fort Lee house felt like a cage with its comforts turned hollow. That night, April 8th, his goodbyes were perfunctory, a muttered promise to his wife, Edna, that he'd return before midnight. His Cadillac gleamed darkly under the street lamp, a chariot bearing him toward a fate he sensed but could not alter. The passenger, silent and coiled with a practiced menace, slid in beside him, eyes fixed ahead, hands clasped but never relaxed. The car rolled through darkened streets where the night wind whispered, carrying the echoes of too many deals gone wrong. The silence was not empty. It thrummed with unsaid words, unfinished threats. When the car came to an unexpected stop, Tony's pulse jumped. The breath he drew tasted of metal, of things left unsaid and promises broken. A movement, quick, decisive, and the flash of a blade under the starlight. Blood, hot and sticky, spread across the leather, staining it deeper than any past sin. The last sound Tony heard was the quiet slam of a car door, the final punctuation to his life's brutal tale. The news barely made it past hushed conversations and thinly veiled smirks. Pasquale Pazzi, Ryan Eboli claimed Tony's old territories like a hyena over a fallen lion, eyes glittering with triumph. In darkened corners, men swore that Genovese had pulled the strings even from his cell, smirking as the name of Tony Bender faded into the silence that always followed a fall in the underworld. A silence punctuated only by the occasional whispered word, and the knowledge that no one was safe from the ghost of their sins.
Underneath the veneer of Buffalo's brick and mortar, where shadows crept in the spaces between streetlights and whispered sins were currency, Federico Lupo Randaccio built an empire on a foundation of blood and bone. His ascent began in Palermo, a city that taught him that power is seized, not given, and continued in the labyrinth of Buffalo's underworld, where every breath came at the cost of another man's life. Known as Lupo for the wolfish grin that lingered when his enemies fell silent, Randaccio was more specter than man. A force of nature with cold eyes and hands calloused from the unforgiving art of violence. But even the darkest of predators must reckon with the light. Here lies the story of a mobster whose reign left a trail so crimson it stained history itself, and whose end came not with a bang, but the slow, cold drag of fate. Federico Lupo Randaccio was born into the heat of Palermo's labyrinthine streets, where the sun burned with the same intensity as the ambition in his blood. His father, Umberto, had set sail from those suffocating alleys for the promise of America, a land that whispered of power and fortune hidden in smoke-filled rooms and the clink of whiskey glasses. When Federico and his family followed, they left their name, Randaccio, buried beneath the cobblestones, adopting the alias Fassi as a temporary disguise. But a name is only a mask, and Federico shed it as he grew, letting the darkness beneath show. Buffalo in the early 20th century was a city where opportunity reeked of sweat and blood. It was a city alive with the hum of illicit transactions, a grinding industrial symphony that thrived in the alleys and basements where sunlight dared not venture. Federico felt the city's pulse in his bones, even as a boy. By the time he was 13, the police blotters knew his name, scrawled in ink that seemed to bleed across their pages. His first arrest was like a baptism into the underworld, an initiation that left bruises and hardened looks. The second came 2 years later, sealing his reputation. By then, the DeCarlo gang, predators in a world of scavengers, had their eyes on the young wolf who prowled Buffalo's streets with a fearless snarl. Randaccio's fists were calloused from fights that ended with him standing over the crumpled bodies of those who dared cross him. He learned to slip a blade between ribs as easily as he collected debts for the DeCarlo brothers. His name grew synonymous with threats whispered under the breath, with payments made on shaking knees. In 1925, the law finally clawed at him, dragging him into the cells for gambling, but it was only the beginning. By 1926, bootlegging turned the city into a battlefield where men bled for barrels of contraband liquor. Federico thrived in the chaos, finding the thrill in each brawl, each gunshot that echoed in the back alleys. In 1928, violence spilled into the open. A $10 fine was a laughable penance for a third-degree assault, but in a world where respect was carved out with fists and knives, it was another notch in his legend. The following year, when he and Umberto were hauled in as suspects for Joseph Syracuse's murder, Federico stood silent, his eyes gleaming with a wolfish hunger that told the authorities they'd caught the wrong men, or the right ones, if only they had the courage to admit it. The fall came swift and brutal in 1930, like a trap closing its iron jaws. Convicted of first-degree robbery, Federico found himself staring at the cold, unforgiving walls of Elmira Reformatory. 10 years inside taught him patience as much as it nurtured his rage. Parole violations returned him to the steel cages time and again, until 1941 finally saw him freed, older, wiser, and more dangerous. The war raged overseas, but Federico's war was on Buffalo's streets. 6 months in the U.S. Army earned him citizenship and an honorable discharge. No tales of heroism, just the cunning to exploit a system that thought it could bend him. Back in Buffalo, Randaccio moved through the city's criminal veins, his influence like poison. The names DeCarlo and Tronoloni commanded fear, and Randaccio was their enforcer. He oversaw the horse race wire rooms where fortunes were won and lost on trembling dice. When Edward Pospichal dared crusade against the gambling dens, his body was found days later, cold and stiff, eyes wide as if death had come whispering secrets in the dark. The late 1950s saw the FBI circle like vultures above a battlefield. J. Edgar Hoover's Top Hoodlum program painted a target on Randaccio's back, but he carried on, unbothered. A wolf moving through the trees while hunters crashed clumsily behind. The murders of Frank and Fred Aquino in 1958 sent a shiver through the underworld. Their bodies, left to cool on the damp earth, were silent reminders that dissent had only one end. When Vincent Santangelo and Anthony Palestine were found lifeless in 1961, Buffalo's criminals knew their city had a new order, an order enforced with steel and the wet sound of life leaving a man's body. But even wolves are not immune to traps. November 1961 saw Alberto Agueti's body, discovered in a Rochester cornfield, charred beyond recognition, save for the teeth that snarled in death. Rumors ran thick, and whispers claimed that Randaccio had spoken of the deed, his voice crackling over FBI surveillance like fire across dry leaves. In 1967, a police raid at Panaro's Lounge set the stage for humiliation. The club's heavy doors splintered under police boots, the air thick with shouted orders and cigarette smoke. As Randaccio was dragged into the glare of headlights, he spat curses at the officers, each word a promise. The courtroom scenes were a theater of dread. Pascal Calabrese, a former confidant, took the stand, his words like poison-tipped arrows. Faces hardened as verdicts were read. Randaccio and his associates condemned to 20 years. The chains that bound him now were heavier, the silence of the prison more suffocating. He emerged at 71, an old wolf, scarred and lean but alive. His return to Buffalo was no triumphant march, but a slow fade into shadowed corners. The city had changed. It buzzed with younger, hungrier men who did not remember what it meant to fear him. Federico Lupo Randaccio spent his final years watching, the memory of blood and power flickering in his dark eyes. On October 4, 2004, death came not with the roar of gunfire or the cold slice of a blade, but silently, like an old friend. The last breath of the wolf rattled in his chest, leaving behind a city that still whispered his name, not with reverence, but with relief.
In the bloody chronicles of New England's underworld, few figures loom as darkly as Frank Butsy Morelli. Born into the grit and grind of Providence's backstreets, Morelli wasn't just a product of his environment, he was its master. He orchestrated chaos with the deftness of a puppeteer, dragging Prohibition-era smuggling and gambling rackets into the deadly spotlight. His ascent was paved in blood, every step marked by the hollow-eyed stare of those who had crossed him. But in the shadowed world he built, no crown rests without a price. Behind the growl of the engines and the whispered threats, Morelli's tale spirals through betrayals and violence that leave no man unscarred. This is not just a story of greed and ambition. It's the brutal ballad of a man who danced with death until it led him into a silence that could not be undone. Frank Butsy Morelli was not born into violence, yet he carried it like an heirloom. Under the gas lamps of Providence's North End, where the shadows seem more permanent, his legacy began. His parents, Gennaro and Filomena Mollarelli, hardened immigrants who had traced their lineage back to the stone streets of Foggia, Italy, unknowingly planted their youngest son, Adolfo, into the grim soil of Providence's underworld. The name Adolfo would eventually be discarded like a snake's shed skin as Morelli emerged, peeling the past in exchange for a name that would echo in whispered tones throughout New England: Butsy. In the early years, the boys of Ledge Street were a ragtag legion, their play interrupted by the clamour of police whistles and the clank of steel doors. Joe Morelli, the eldest, was the sun around which this rough constellation of siblings revolved. They were boys, then thieves, then something colder. Under Joe's lead, they became the Morelli Gang, a feral pack that included neighbourhood toughs like Joseph Jipp, the Bloody Mondi, and Anthony Mancini, who swaggered down the streets with a promise of broken bones. Their turf was marked not by graffiti, but by the sudden silence that accompanied their approach. His first true ascent came with a score that tasted of salt and sweat, shipments pulled from trains under the cloak of midnight. In 1919, the Morelli brothers pilfered crates of shoes from freight cars, their laughter swallowed by the dark. But laughter had its limits, and the sound turned to muttered curses when a payroll heist went awry. Joe's arrogance put the police too close on their heels, and in 1920, the shackles followed. The brothers' wrists, once free to grasp at gold and blood, now knew only the cold of iron cuffs. The trial was swift, the sentence unyielding. Atlanta Federal Prison loomed like a shadow. Fred and Frank were caught in its clutches alongside their ring of misfits, but this was just a setback. Morelli emerged in February 1924, eyes colder, jaw set with a grim understanding. The Prohibition era welcomed him back with open arms, a time when liquor poured like liquid gold through clandestine tunnels. Months passed before the first body fell. A man caught selling information to an overzealous newspaper. He was found slumped in a narrow alley, eyes wide and mouth stuffed with print, ink smudging into the hollow of his cheeks. It was Butsy's message, an unspoken decree that Providence was no place for loose tongues. The streets were his now, marked by the sudden snap of gunfire and the silent, knowing nods of men who swore loyalty with shaking hands. But power is a drug with a bitter aftertaste. By 1931, Morelli's grip was challenged not by bullets but by fire. A rival's gambling den erupted in an orange blaze one damp evening, windows exploding outward with the force of vengeance. Onlookers could only flinch as shards of glass fell like deadly rain. Morelli was the whispered name that night, his grin the stuff of nightmares, though the police found nothing but cinders and questions when dawn crept in. Providence was a city stitched together by fear, and Butsy was the needle. The years dragged on, painted in bruises and betrayal. As the Prohibition dust settled, new blood tested the waters, men with eyes that glittered like blades. Raymond Petriarca was one such man, a predator who watched Morelli with the patience of a vulture. Butsy, for all his sharpened instincts, had grown weary. Cancer chewed at his jaw like a punishment sent from below, leaving him marked with scars that stretched white and taut across his face. By 1947, even Havana, with its salt air and tobacco-stained parlours, failed to stir the hunger that had once defined him. The decline came not with a final blaze, but with the slow suffocation of relevance. With Raymond now free and fiending for power, Morelli retreated into the background, his voice now a rasp, his control of crime ceded to the younger Patriarcha. Providence moved on without him, the city's pulse quickened by new violence, new kings. But Butsy remained, a ghost still tugged by the frayed thread of his legend. When death came in 1965, it was without ceremony. The cancer returned, gnawing at what little defiance was left in him. They buried him in St. Anne's Cemetery under the whispering oaks, where no priest's voice dared rise in song. His grave was marked with stone, but in Providence it was the quiet that marked his passing, the kind that follows a storm's end, a silence taut with the memory of thunder. If survival was a prayer in the Mafia's unforgiving game, then crossing paths with Tommaso Petto was its cruelest curse. Dubbed Il Bove, also known as the Ox, Petto was no mere enforcer. He was the embodiment of brute force, a storm wrapped in sinew and muscle, capable of snuffing out life with a squeeze of his vise-like arms. But even monsters have their reckoning. His story, drenched in violence and shadow, led him from the cobblestones of New York City to a fateful, bullet-riddled night in Pennsylvania. Here in the lonely stillness broken by gunfire, the butcher became the butchered, his own blood seeping into the earth that had borne witness to so many of his sins. This is the tale of Il Bove, where murder met poetic justice on a cold, dark road in Pennsylvania, and vengeance wrote its final chapter with gunpowder and bone. Tommaso Petto, better known as Il Bove, did not walk the streets of early 20th century New York City. He prowled them. Born in Palermo's unforgiving alleys around 1879, Petto embodied the fierce, unrelenting spirit of the old world. He arrived on American shores with a legacy already inked in blood, a saga he would continue, one bone-crushing grip at a time. At 5'8", with a body carved from slabs of muscle, he bore the kind of bulk that cast fear as naturally as the moon cast shadows. His presence was not just seen, it was felt, like the crackle of thunder before a storm. The air in Little Italy was thick with the mingled scents of garlic and sweat, but the blood that stained its narrow alleys was sharper still. In this world, Petto thrived, taking on roles that few dared to accept. By the time whispers of the barrel murder spread through the tenements in 1903, he was already a name weighted with menace. Benedetto Madonia's body, curled grotesquely within the splintered confines of a barrel, had been discovered with limbs bent at unnatural angles and a death mask of terror frozen across his face. The victim's eyes, wide and lifeless, seemed to implore the heavens for mercy that had never come. When detectives pounded on Petto's door, the glint of a pawn ticket was their proof, the thin thread linking him to Madonia's silenced breath. But Ilbove was not a beast that cowered. As iron shackles were fastened, he lunged with a sudden, terrifying burst of strength, wrapping his monstrous arms around the most formidable officer in the squad. Bones creaked under the force, eyes bulged as the detective's breath faltered, on the brink of snapping into the dark. It took 3 others to tear Peto away, their hearts thundering in their chests long after the cell door clanged shut behind him. The tomb's prison, with its clammy walls and the ever-present drip of water that echoed like a death knell, became his realm of silence. Days bled into weeks as evidence began to erode and witnesses' tongues stiffened in their throats. Fear had a name, and it was Ilbove. The trial never came, and in January 1904, the iron jaws of confinement opened, setting Peto free into the cold embrace of the city. Celebrations swelled through Mulberry Street, a brittle sort of joy that cracked at the edges. Wine and laughter masked the nervous dart of eyes. It was there, amidst the low rumble of voices, that a telephone call cut through, urgent and insistent. Peto's features darkened as he listened, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He left that night, swallowed by the murk of unknown roads, while shadows whispered his name. By 1905, Ilbove resurfaced in the coal-dusted settlement of Old Forge, Pennsylvania, a place where soot blackened both buildings and souls. His butcher shop on South Main Street was a front, the scent of raw meat mingling with more sinister secrets. In the back room, under dim lamplight, Peto conducted business that left men shaking, their palms slick with sweat. Not long after his arrival, the decapitated body of Frank Coloro was discovered near the yawning darkness of an abandoned mine shaft, the head severed cleanly, set apart like a grotesque offering. Locals avoided Peto's eyes, and the whispers that trailed him became indistinguishable from the wind. October 21st, 1905, brought with it a chill that gnawed at the bone. Peto lingered late at his shop, the air filled with the wet sound of cleavers and the glisten of red-streaked aprons. When he stepped out, the moon hung low, casting a silvered path across the rough cobblestones. Each step he took towards home was heavy, deliberate, as if he sensed the silent promise of violence lingering in the darkness. The crack of a gun shattered the night. The first blast struck him in the side, small pellets embedding into the thick muscle of his arm and ribs. A shuddering growl escaped his lips, more rage than pain, as he staggered and reached for his revolver. But a second shot followed, more vicious, burrowing into his chest and splintering his spine. The weapon fell from his ruined hand, fingers snapping apart like brittle twigs as bone and metal were pulverized by the impact. His eyes flared with the wild defiance of a beast cornered, even as blood bubbled at his lips, staining his teeth crimson. A final shot cracked through his right elbow, a splintering explosion of bone that rendered his arm useless. The revolver clattered to the ground, a useless hunk of metal. Silence rushed back in, broken only by the faint echo of retreating footsteps and the soft rustle of leaves. Inside, his wife heard the eruption of violence, the sound skittering down her spine like ice. She ran, feet slipping on the uneven street, until she saw him crumpled at the threshold of their home. Blood pooled in the uneven cracks beneath him, glistening darkly in the moonlight. His eyes were fixed open, glassy and unseeing, as if even in death he could not surrender. The coroner's inquest was a farce, a procession of silence where no one spoke the truth they all knew. Ilbove's death was marked as the act of a faceless avenger, a verdict that settled over the town like the final notes of a funeral dirge. Rumours named Giuseppe Di Primo, a name that twisted on lips with the bitterness of retribution. But facts are thin armour against fear, and even William Flynn of the Secret Service knew the truth was muddied. Di Primo, they said, was still bound in prison walls during Peto's murder, a claim that raised more questions than it answered. Peto was laid to rest in the shadowed confines of Market Street Cemetery, his grave marked by stone and surrounded by the whispers of the dead. In the wake of his burial, his widow packed what remained of their life, her children clinging to her skirts as they vanished into the city, leaving behind only the echo of Ilbove's name, a warning, a memory, a ghost.